A shadow stretches across the soil, ancient and trembling. There is no name for it yet, no word for betrayal, no law against blood, only a whisper of wind through the tall grass, and two brothers, still young in the garden of time, stepping further into something darker than the world has ever known. The trees watch silently. The earth listens. The story of Cain does not begin with murder. It begins with offering, with ritual, with two altars raised on bare earth, one smoldering with smoke that drifts upward, accepted, the other left heavy with fruit, untouched by fire or favor. A divine glance tips the balance. One brother's gift is chosen, the other's is ignored. No reason given, no explanation needed, only silence, and in silence, something begins to coil. Cain's heart cracks quietly, not with rage, not yet, but with the slow grind of being unseen. He who tilled the earth now feels its weight press back upon him, the fruit of his labor rejected. The soil, his only companion, becomes mute beneath his hands. His brother Abel, whose lambs bleated with innocence, walks away with heaven's nod. It is not the murder that is primal. It is the feeling that the world is unfair and no God is answering. In that moment, Cain becomes more than a man. He becomes the first exile in waiting. And yet, the divine speaks to him, softly, warning, questioning, inviting him to master the beast that stirs at his door. Sin desires you, the voice says, but you must master it. It is the first moral fork in the story of humanity, and Cain chooses. The field is silent, save for the rhythm of steps. There are no witnesses, no cries, just one man standing and one body falling. Blood touches earth for the first time, and the earth recoils. It opens its mouth not to consume the offering, but to testify against it. The soil, once friend to the farmer, now becomes the witness of his curse. But here, something unexpected happens. The punishment does not match the crime. It surpasses it in strangeness. Cain is not killed.
He is not bound. He is not cast into fire or chained to stone. He is marked, not for death, but for life. Eternal, wandering, protected exile. The first true curse is not mortality. It is survival without belonging. The mark of Cain is never described, not its color, not its shape. It is not seen but felt, a metaphysical brand that echoes down through myth, symbol, and psyche. It is a symbol of liminal existence, of being cut off from tribe and ritual, yet preserved by divine decree. A paradox made flesh. The first murderer is turned into the first ghost, wandering the edges of the human story. He leaves, but he does not vanish. He walks east of Eden, into the unknown, into the wilderness beyond myth, where names grow strange and cities rise from wounds. He marries, he builds, he fathers generations. He becomes a builder of civilization. The paradox deepens. From his blood flows both violence and culture, murder and music, vengeance and invention. Cain is not a closed wound in the Bible. He is a living scar. The story does not end when Abel dies. It begins. The earth that drank his brother's blood becomes the foundation of cities. The soul that held unspoken wrath becomes the ancestor of artisans and ironworkers. Humanity's first sin becomes its first legacy. The murderer becomes the myth. And yet the question remains, why was Cain spared? Why did God mark him, not for destruction, but protection? What secret does the curse contain? In the silence between verses, in the dust beneath his feet, something ancient still whispers. It is the whisper of footsteps on soil that has never known a name. The silence of a man walking not toward a destination, but away from everything that gave him meaning. Cain, marked and spared, becomes the first wanderer. the prototype of the outsider. And as he moves east of Eden, a new archetype takes root in the world. The cursed survivor. In every culture there is a figure like him, a being who has seen something forbidden, who carries a burden too old for language. Cain does not speak of his crime again. He does not repent, nor does he protest. He simply continues. That is his punishment. To exist without remedy, to bear a divine scar that no water can wash away. He settles in the land of Nod, a name that means wandering, yet he settles. There paradox becomes prophecy. The marked becomes the builder. The exile becomes the founder. Cain erects a city and names it after his son, Enoch. From murder blooms architecture. From wrath comes lineage. He plants the first stone of civilization, and yet he is forever barred from its sanctuary. This is the essence of the curse. Not to be destroyed, but to watch life grow from the very blood he spilled. He becomes the father of invention. His descendants forge tools, invent instruments, tame fire. Jubal, his descendant, father's music, Tubal-Cain, metallurgy. And yet their legacy is not purity, but power. Cain's bloodline teaches the world to build and to conquer. But beneath every innovation lies the mark. That whisper, that original fracture. The city he builds is not Eden regained. It is a monument to the wound. The stones carry no absolution. They merely rise higher, echoing the human desire to mask guilt with progress. We inherit his pattern. We raise towers not to reach God, but to forget the silence after violence. Some traditions claim Cain never died, that he wanders still, unseen, just beyond the reach of the civilized world. He is said to appear in times of great moral collapse, not to punish, but to remind. His presence is the weight behind certain dreams, the shadow beneath certain myths. To look upon him is to remember the unbearable truth, that human hands built beauty with blood still on them. The mark, we must understand, was not only protection, it was a boundary. It forbade others from taking vengeance, but it also prevented reconciliation. Cain could not return. He could not bury his brother in peace. He lived forward, but not free. His children did not inherit guilt, but they bore its architecture. And so, the legacy grows stranger. Generations pass. The Bible names 7. Then comes Lamech, a descendant of Cain, who kills again and boasts of it. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, he says, then Lamech 77-fold. The cycle begins again, magnified. Violence begets pride. Pride births vengeance, and vengeance calcifies into civilization. Here lies the second curse, not just to murder, but to institutionalize it. What was once a solitary act in the field becomes a philosophy. Cain's city gives rise to dynasties. His children shape the world, not in his name but in his shadow. No temple is built without sacrifice, no empire without conquest. The blood cries out, and we learn to call it glory. And yet, the myth endures, not because it justifies, but because it reveals. Cain is not the villain we are taught to fear. He is the mirror we refuse to face. He is not the monster beneath the bed. He is the silence in our own hearts when justice feels out of reach. The mark was never to protect him from others. It was to protect others from becoming him. He walks still, not in flesh perhaps, but in form, in the stories we tell of exile, of guilt, of second chances we never take. He builds, and we live in what he began, cities of law and war, sanctuaries built on forgetting. But what was it he truly began? Not merely a city of stone and smoke, but a pattern inscribed deep into the marrow of mankind. Cain did not invent evil, he revealed it. He tore the veil off the human soul and showed what lies beneath when silence falls after injustice. And we, children of his myth, have not looked away since. He began the architecture of guilt, invisible, generational, self-sustaining. A structure not made of bricks, but of decisions deferred, truths buried, wounds passed down like inheritance.
Cain's curse was not the mark upon his skin, but the echo he left in every act of unchecked ambition. To live in what he began is to live surrounded by reminders of what we refuse to face. The Bible moves on quickly from Cain, but the myth does not. It seeps into the roots of other stories, reshaping heroes and monsters alike. The first murder becomes the archetype of all betrayals, all fallings out between kin, all ruptures where love could not stop the blade. Abel is never resurrected, never replaced. His silence is the most enduring voice of all, a scream turned into soil. The ground itself was cursed by his blood. That detail lingers. The soil, once fertile under Abel's feet and Cain's plow, becomes stained. Not just in symbolism, but in function. It will no longer yield for you, God says. The punishment is exile not only from people, but from the earth itself, the loss of harmony with nature. Cain becomes a fugitive in both spirit and habitat. And here something strange and quiet takes form. A theology of estrangement, a spirituality of being unrooted. Cain is not simply punished, he is transformed. He becomes the model of the modern soul, alienated, ambitious, protected, but restless. His story becomes a map we follow unconsciously, over and over, whenever we confuse survival for salvation. Some scholars have argued Cain was a necessary figure, not a villain, but a vessel. A character carved to hold the unbearable weight of human contradiction. We need him, they say, because without him, there is no mirror. Abel, the innocent, is too perfect. He dies too early. It is Cain who lives long enough to show us ourselves. This interpretation changes the shape of the myth. Suddenly, Cain is not just the first murderer. He is the first mirror. The one through whom we see what happens when jealousy meets power, when divine silence meets desperate need, when the human desire to be seen goes unfulfilled. He is the one who reminds us that being overlooked can wound deeper than being wronged. He becomes the first existential figure, a soul cast adrift, not because of punishment alone, but because of meaning lost. His city, Enoch, is built as much out of fear as it is out of stone. A fear of being forgotten, a fear that his story might end with the curse and not the consequence. And so he builds. We build. We name. We shape the world with hands still trembling from the first fall. And still, the mark remains. What is it, this mark? Not a scar, not a sigil. Perhaps it is time itself, the knowledge of what one has done and what one cannot undo. Perhaps the mark is memory, an immortal memory embedded in flesh. It does not kill, it does not heal. It simply declares, this one remembers. Cain walks through Scripture like a shadow through sunlight, rarely mentioned, but always present. His line is said to vanish in the flood, but his essence, it survives. In kings who build empires to silence guilt, in strangers who wander, always searching, in every moment when justice is demanded but not delivered. Because what Cain began was not just a city. What Cain began was the story of what we do after paradise is lost. But what if Cain himself was not the beginning, only the mask worn by something older? Before cities, before altars, before even the names of men, there was already a crack in the garden's perfection.
The serpent did not kill. The fruit did not bleed. It was Cain who first taught the world that Eden could be stained. Yet what if he was not just the first sinner, but the scapegoat of a deeper fear? There is a pattern buried in the myth. The perfect sibling destroyed, the imperfect one left to wander. In many cultures, this pattern repeats: the divine child slain, the rival spared. The gods do not always explain why. They choose favorites, they demand sacrifice. And in the silence that follows, the survivors are left to carry the weight. Cain's curse may not be a punishment. It may be a reflection of divine ambivalence. This is the first fracture in the tale's surface. What if Cain's offering was not rejected because it was lesser, but because it represented something unclean to the divine order? He brought the fruits of labor, cultivated, altered, shaped by human hands. Abel brought a life, unblemished, surrendered whole. One gift spoke of man's will, the other of man's surrender. In that contrast, perhaps, lies the true offense. Cain's story then becomes not just a tragedy, but a condemnation of civilization itself. Agriculture, industry, ownership, the manipulation of nature. These are his domains. He tills the ground, controls the harvest, bends the world to his will. And that control, that autonomy, may be what the divine recoils from. Abel offers blood. Cain offers bread. God accepts one. The myth never explains, but it remembers. This reframing changes the axis of guilt. Cain is no longer simply jealous. He is representative. He brings forth the first sign of man attempting to shape the world, and the world, or its creator, punishes him not for failure, but for presumption. It is not murder alone that marks him. It is the audacity to build, to choose, to declare, "This is mine." What if the curse of Cain is not divine wrath, but divine fear? The fear that man will no longer obey, that he will no longer wait in Eden's garden to be fed, but will plant his own seeds. The myth becomes an echo of an ancient anxiety, the birth of autonomy, the end of innocence. Cain, in killing Abel, kills not just his brother. He kills the paradigm of dependence. And so he is exiled not for crime, but for evolution. From this angle, the mark takes on new meaning. It is not just a warning, it is a containment, a signal to the heavens that the experiment has shifted. The age of innocence is over. The age of agency has begun. Cain walks the earth not as a fugitive, but as a threshold, a living boundary between paradise and progress. This is the first twist in the myth. Cain is no longer the villain. He is the vessel through which humanity leaves the garden entirely. He does not fall, he walks. And what he leaves behind is not peace, but purity. He exchanges the divine gaze for human will. And for that, he is both punished and preserved. It is easier to call him evil than to admit we are built in his image. Easier to name him cursed than to acknowledge that everything we have, every city, every song, every tool, began with the echo of his footsteps. It is not the murder that defines him, but what comes after. Because what comes after Cain is us. This is the most unsettling truth. We are not descendants of Abel. He left no children, no line, no legacy. His voice cried from the ground, but it did not carry forward through blood. It was Cain who built, who begat, who began the lineage of man. Every culture that shapes iron, that raises walls, that writes its laws in stone, walks in the shadow of the marked one. We are not the children of the innocent. We are the children of the one who survived. To understand this is to feel the myth shift beneath your feet. The story ceases to be a fable of morality and becomes a confession of origin. We were not born in virtue. We were born in rupture, and perhaps that is why we are obsessed with justice, with punishment, with judgment, because somewhere deep within, we know our first father was spared, and that his curse never ended. Even today, the myth endures in disguised forms. In literature, Cain appears as the brooding brother, the tortured anti-hero. In psychology, he becomes the symbol of repressed rage, the wound of being overlooked, the fury of not being chosen. In politics, he is the architect of systems, powerful, creative, often cruel. We do not always call him Cain, but we recognize him when we see him. He is the stranger with haunted eyes who builds cathedrals and walls. He is the genius driven to create and destroy. He is the leader who cannot rest. He is the father who carries a silence his children cannot name. And most of all, he is the voice in our own minds that asks, "Why not me? Why not my offering?"
This is the echo of the field, the place where one man stood and another fell, and the universe did not intervene. The myth has endured, not because it condemns Cain, but because it explains us. It speaks to the guilt that festers in progress, the violence behind inheritance. We call it civilization, but we build it from broken soil. Every city is a Cainite echo, every monument a monument to survival, not innocence, not justice, but survival. Even the mark itself begins to resemble something new. Not a curse, but a wound carried with dignity, an invisible badge of experience. Cain becomes the first bearer of the trauma that shapes future generations. And perhaps this is why he was protected, not out of mercy, but necessity. A world without Cain would be a world with no witness to the weight of consequence, a world without memory. It is in this space, the uncomfortable, holy ambiguity, that the myth becomes most powerful. Because we are taught to reject Cain, and yet we imitate him. We expand, create, destroy, question, wander. We take the burden of divine silence and fill it with industry, poetry, war. And through it all, we carry the whisper. You are marked. You are spared. You are seen. This is the paradox. The myth does not close its door. It invites us in. It asks not who Abel was, but who Cain became and who we are becoming. Because if Cain built the first city, then each of us lives in one of its rooms. And somewhere, on the stones, the mark still lingers. It lingers in ways we no longer recognize, as ambition that devours, as sorrow passed silently from parent to child, as the ache of building something grand from a broken foundation. The myth of Cain was never meant to remain in Scripture. It was meant to haunt thresholds, the threshold of the city, of the conscience, of the soul itself. And now, the myth begins to shift. No longer content to stay buried in ancient soil, it begins to take on new forms, to appear in strange disguises. In medieval legends, Cain becomes a cursed wanderer, sometimes mistaken for the wandering Jew, a figure doomed to live until the end of time, never to find peace, never to forget. In other tales, he is the father of monsters, of giants, of demons who inherit not his body, but his burden. The myth splinters like light through stained glass, revealing something unsettling. The deeper the story moves through history, the more distorted it becomes. Cain, once merely cursed, becomes the symbol of all that is other, foreign, feared, rejected. He ceases to be a man and becomes a metaphor. And metaphors, unlike men, cannot defend themselves. It is here the second twist reveals itself. If Cain is the ancestor of all civilization, why has he been so persistently cast as inhuman? Why has the myth been sharpened against him? The answer may lie not in theology, but in psychology, or more precisely, in projection. Humanity cannot bear to carry its own guilt without finding a vessel for it, and Cain, already marked, becomes the perfect scapegoat. The tragedy is doubled. The first exile becomes the eternal exile. The man who tried to live beyond his crime is turned into the crime itself. Later traditions claim his blood turned black, his children bore his shame in their skin, his soul wandered the earth howling. These are not revelations. They are reflections of fear. Fear that guilt might be universal, that the wound might be inherited. And so the myth is twisted. Cain, once our mirror, becomes our monster. But in doing this, we forget the silence of God in the moment of the crime. We forget that the divine voice did not stop the murder, did not protect the innocent, did not erase the guilty. Instead, it left them both, one in the ground and one in the wilderness. The absence becomes the answer, and Cain's loneliness becomes our inheritance. What if the mark was not punishment but permission? A sign that even the worst among us is allowed to continue, not to escape consequence, but to carry it.
A walking reminder that the story never ends with blood. It ends with what we do after the blood is spilled. In this way, Cain becomes not the villain, but the keeper of memory. He bears the story that no one else could hold. Not Adam, not Eve, not Abel. Only Cain walks long enough to remember. And in remembering, he keeps the myth alive. We inherit this too. Our guilt, our grief, our need to build meaning from brokenness. The myth's power lies not in condemning him, but in recognizing that we are all in some way marked. Not all with murder, but all with memory. And from that memory, we build. Because the myth of Cain was never meant to stay in the past. It was meant to follow us into the cities he taught us to build. And it has. The mark of Cain lingers not only in myth, but in mortar. In the echo of boots on pavement, in the iron frameworks that cage the sky, in laws written with trembling hands. Every civilization bears his architecture, visible in its towers, hidden in its rituals, etched in the quiet spaces between crime and consequence. His ghost is not a figure in the woods. It's in the boardroom, the courtroom, the confessional. It sits beside the builder and the judge alike. But there is another place the myth has taken root: the human psyche. In the dream world, Cain returns again and again, not as a murderer, but as a wanderer with haunted eyes. He comes to those who fear they've gone too far, to those who carry secrets, to those who believe they are beyond forgiveness. He does not accuse. He stands. He waits. He remembers. Psychologically, Cain becomes the archetype of internal exile, the part of us that cannot go home again. Not because the gates are locked, but because we have locked ourselves out. We speak of guilt, of shame, of self-condemnation. But deeper still is the Cainic wound, the feeling that one has been cast out, not just from love, but from origin. It is a wound not easily seen. It manifests in perfectionism, in rage, in detachment. In the inability to feel fully chosen, fully known, Abel dies once in the story. But in the mind of the marked, he dies again and again, each time a person compares their worth and finds it wanting. This is the hidden murder, not of another, but of the self. The mark, then, is not a symbol of divine wrath, but of internal division. It is what remains when the soul splits in two, one part crying out for absolution, the other wandering without a name. And in this, Cain becomes not merely a biblical figure, but a universal one.
He is the part of every human being that has loved and lost, strived and been unseen, acted out, and been left standing in the aftermath. There is something deeply modern about him. Unlike the heroes of myth who rise and fall in clarity, Cain exists in ambiguity. He is spared but not saved, protected but not embraced. His story ends with a city, not redemption. He is the first man to carry contradiction, and that makes him the most human of all. This is why his myth has never died. It shifts with us, evolves with us, stays close to our breath. In times of peace, we remember Abel. In times of reckoning, we return to Cain, to ask what it means to be marked, to question whether the punishment was survival itself, to wonder if we too have been building to forget. In this light, the myth offers something strange. Not condemnation, but kinship. Cain does not vanish into shadow to be feared. He walks ahead, bearing the story we dare not speak. The one about what it costs to be human, what it costs to try, to fail, to wound and be wounded. He is not excused, but he is not erased. And if he can walk with the mark, then so can we. Because to carry the mark is not to be lost forever. It is to know that the journey forward is longer than we thought. But what if the journey was never meant to be forward? What if the myth of Cain is not linear, but circular? A labyrinth rather than a road.
For every step Cain takes away from Eden, he also draws a spiral around the center he can never return to. And within that spiral, something ancient waits, not to punish, but to reveal. This is the second great inversion in the myth. The deeper you go into Cain's curse, the more it begins to resemble a calling. Not a holy one, but a necessary one. A descent into awareness. A path through guilt, not around it. He is not simply running from what he did. He is being initiated into what it means to live with the knowledge of what he is capable of. The murder is the threshold. The mark is the passage. What lies beyond is the mystery. Cain becomes the first to face what others only fear, the confrontation with consequence. Where Adam and Eve fell in innocence, Cain falls in full awareness. He sees what he's done. He feels it. He walks in it. And yet he continues. In doing so, he carves out a path that future generations will follow. Not because they must, but because they already have. He becomes the father not of sin, but of reckoning. This is why the myth survives. It is not about violence alone. It is about aftermath. After the act, after the curse, after the exile, what remains? What begins? The story does not close its gates. It opens a door into the shadowed terrain of self-knowledge, of memory, of inherited shame and chosen resilience. And this is where we begin to see the secret heart of the myth. Cain's story is not separate from the divine. It is entwined with it. The same God who rejects his offering protects his life. The same voice that warns him of sin marks him for mercy. It is a paradox so old we've stopped seeing it. But there it is, flickering behind the blood and soil. Judgment wrapped in strange grace. Not forgiveness, but something adjacent, something older. What if God needed Cain, not as an example, but as an instrument? A bearer of the unbearable. A prototype not of purity, but of perseverance. Because in Cain, the divine mystery does something it does not do with Adam or Noah or even Moses. It allows ambiguity. It makes room for a figure who is both broken and spared, who is not restored but not destroyed, who walks and walks and walks. This is the inheritance we rarely name. Not original sin, but original ambiguity. A myth that refuses to resolve. A figure who carries both curse and covenant, ruin and continuation.
We do not pray to Cain, but we walk in his steps, whenever we choose not to hide from what we've done and keep living anyway. And perhaps that is the true mark, the refusal to vanish. Cain does not disappear. He does not become mythic smoke. He marries. He fathers. He builds. He plants his sorrow in the earth and harvests what he can. And the world continues, not in spite of him, but because of him. He carries memory, and memory carries him. And we who follow begin to remember too. But memory is never neutral. It shapes us as much as we shape it. And as we look back through Cain's footsteps, something begins to shimmer, not with darkness alone, but with strange, fractured light. We begin to ask not just what he did, but why we kept his story alive. Why this myth, above so many others, survived the flood of time. It is because Cain's myth holds a mirror to transformation, not the clean, redemptive kind, but the agonizing, incomplete one. The transformation that happens in shadow, after the fall, after the fire. The kind that leaves scars instead of halos. Cain is not redeemed, but he is changed. And in his change, he becomes something sacred in disguise. This is the third face of the myth. Not murder, not punishment, but evolution. The same man who struck his brother down becomes the ancestor of musicians, smiths, dwellers of tents. The line of Cain is not destroyed. It becomes culture. From his offspring come art and craft, metallurgy and melody, the shaping of the world by human hands. It is as if the myth is saying, yes, the blood was spilled, but something rose from it. This is a dangerous idea. That beauty can grow from brokenness. That civilization might be rooted not in purity, but in grief. It unsettles us because we want our stories to be clean. We want the guilty to vanish, the innocent to triumph, the divine to separate light from dark. But the Cain myth refuses this. It insists. Sometimes the wound is where the world begins, and it is here that the paradox deepens. Because the line of Cain ends before the flood, his descendants wiped away, his city drowned. But the gifts remain. Instruments, tools, language, architecture, all these endure. The myth is careful to preserve their origin, even as it erases the bloodline. It is as if Cain himself disappears, but his spirit continues, scattered, unclaimed, absorbed into the unnamed world. He becomes the anonymous architect of human survival. This is why he must be remembered. Not to justify, not to excuse, but to witness, to hold the unbearable truth that all we have built has come at a cost, that our origins are tangled, that our greatness walks hand in hand with our sorrow. Cain is not the hero of the myth, but he is its heart. The mark, once seen as curse, becomes something else entirely, a reminder not to forget. Not what he did, but what we are capable of. The line between creation and destruction, between building a city and burying a brother. It is thinner than we dare admit. Cain carries both, and so do we. And perhaps this is what God saw. Not only the sin, but the burden. The story, yet unwritten. The future, yet unformed. Cain was not spared to escape judgment. He was spared because the world needed to see what would happen when a man was marked, but not erased. What happens when the murderer becomes the memory? What happens when the broken one becomes the builder? Something ancient begins to stir within this question, not merely about Cain, but about us. If the first builder was the first exile, then what is the true foundation of the cities we inhabit? Are we not, in some way, still building from that same contradiction, using memory as mortar, guilt as blueprint, sorrow as stone?
Here the myth reveals its second great twist. Cain is not only the source of civilization, he is its hidden cornerstone. Not the father of monsters, but the ancestor of inventors. Not the villain, but the architect of continuity. We speak of Abel as the righteous one, but his story ends in silence. It is Cain's voice, wounded and wandering, that echoes through history. The legacy of Cain is not in the act of murder, but in what follows: the refusal to disappear, the stubborn, painful insistence on continuing to shape the world despite the mark, despite the exile, despite the blood. And this, more than anything, makes him human and dangerous, because he proves that life can go on even after moral collapse. This is why ancient traditions struggled with him. They could not banish him entirely. So they transformed him. In one story, he becomes a vampire, cursed to drink blood because he once spilled it. In another, he becomes a giant, towering over men as a warning of unrepented violence. In still others, he is doomed to walk the earth until the Last Judgment. But none of these tales can fully erase him. They only cloak his presence in metaphor, because something deeper endures. Cain is the myth's secret engine, the one who walks when no one else can, who lives with the consequences no one else will touch. He is not forgiven, but he is allowed to go on. And this, perhaps, is the most terrifying grace of all, that we are not always punished with destruction. Sometimes we are punished with continuation, and yet what Cain builds is not nothing. It matters. It becomes history, music, metal, cities, systems. He takes the unbearable and gives it form. That is his inheritance, and now it is ours. Every time we create something from grief, we echo him. Every time we take the shards of shame and shape them into story, into song, into structure, we participate in his lineage.
We do not praise the murder, but we acknowledge the transformation, the terrible, beautiful persistence of those who carry the mark and keep building anyway. This is the Cain who haunts our thresholds, not a shadow behind the door, but a presence beneath the floorboards. The foundation we forgot to question, the ancestor no one claims, yet all inherit. We are not meant to admire him, we are meant to recognize him. In the dream of a perfect world, he does not exist. But in the real world, our world, he walks still. And we walk with him. Because it is not innocence that shapes history. It is survival. And yet survival without reconciliation becomes its own kind of torment. The longer Cain walks, the heavier his silence becomes. The mark may protect his body, but nothing protects his soul. In this shadowed exile, he learns the weight of memory not as punishment, but as presence, a constant companion that cannot be denied, only endured. It is here, in the long echo of aftermath, that the myth deepens into something intimate. Beneath the towering symbolism and ancestral echoes lies a simple human ache, the desire to be seen beyond one's worst moment. Cain is not only the figure who committed the first murder, he is the figure who lived long enough to regret it, to outlive the moment, but never the meaning. No text tells us if Cain wept, but the myth speaks in silence, and the silence is full of grief, not just for Abel, but for the self he can never return to. That is the true cost of the curse, not exile from land, but from identity. He can no longer be a brother, a son, a farmer of peace, only a wanderer, only the marked. In this way, the myth reaches through millennia and touches the rawest part of the human condition, the inability to undo. We speak of forgiveness as if it were a river that washes us clean. But Cain teaches us the darker truth, that some rivers only deepen as you cross them, that some acts cannot be reversed, only remembered. And yet, he walks.
He walks not to escape, but to carry. And through this carrying, something shifts. Because the wound, held long enough, becomes a lens. A way of seeing the world through what has been lost. Cain, the exile, becomes Cain, the observer, the builder, the father of those who shape tools and tones. He does not return to Eden, but he does not vanish either. He becomes something else, the living archive of what we do after breaking. In this light, the mark changes again. It is no longer curse or protection. It becomes a testament, not to what he did, but to what he bears. The mark says, "This one remembers. This one knows the cost. This one cannot pretend." And maybe that is why the myth endures. Because each of us carries moments that cannot be taken back. Words we've spoken, silences we've held, roads we've chosen. We are not all murderers, but we are all marked, in some way, by the things we've survived and the ones we didn't save. Cain becomes not the other, but the mirror. He shows us what it means to walk with the weight of irreversible things, to keep going, to build from ashes, to love in fragments. His is not a story of redemption. It is a story of resilience, and sometimes that is the more sacred tale. For in the absence of absolution, there remains one holy act, to walk forward with eyes open. This too is a kind of prayer, not to be absolved, but to remain awake. And Cain, in his long exile, becomes the first practitioner of this unsung devotion. He walks not toward forgiveness, but into the full weight of his awareness. He becomes the patron saint of the unredeemed, those who live with what cannot be undone, but who refuse to numb it away. In this way, the myth of Cain becomes more than a moral tale. It becomes a spiritual path, a dark, narrow trail cut through the wilderness of guilt, memory, and endurance. Not a path toward heaven, but through the underworld of the human heart. A descent into complexity, a journey beneath the surface.
For there is something strange that happens when one walks that long with sorrow. It begins to soften, not into relief, but into depth. The mark no longer burns, but glows faintly, like an ember carried in the chest. Not a wound, not a brand, but a light. A hidden one, yes, but light nonetheless. And that light is where the myth begins to whisper again. Because what if the mark is not only the symbol of guilt, but also the symbol of consciousness? What if Cain's punishment is not just to wander, but to awaken, to carry memory so deeply that it becomes wisdom, even if no one sees it, to remember not only what was lost, but what was learned in the losing? Here, the myth slides sideways into the soul. Cain becomes the figure of the one who knows, not the priest, not the prophet, but the bearer of silent truths, the kind passed down not in scriptures, but in glances, the kind felt in the hush after an argument, the stillness before a confession, the truths that do not heal, but that guide. This is what we often miss, that some lessons are not for absolution. They are for navigation. They do not erase the past, they illuminate the future. And Cain, despite everything, becomes the first of these strange teachers, not by preaching, but by enduring. He teaches us that guilt can become compassion, that sorrow can become sight, that what we carry, if we carry it fully, can become a kind of strength, not the strength of pride, but of patience, the quiet resilience of one who has nothing left to prove, only something left to bear. And perhaps this is the most profound transformation of all. Cain begins as a figure of rage, then of punishment, then of exile. But in the deepest chamber of the myth, he becomes something else entirely. a guardian, not of innocence, but of complexity. He guards the space where simplicity breaks, where right and wrong blur, where the human soul is asked not to choose sides, but to hold opposites. He guards the truth that we are not only our worst moments, but we are also never free of them. And in that guarding, the myth itself becomes sacred. Because to walk forward with eyes open is to say, I see what I did, I see what I lost, and I will not turn away. In that vow, the myth reaches its deepest point, not in punishment, but in presence. Cain becomes more than a story about crime. He becomes the myth of facing oneself without flinching, the myth of bearing the unbearable and continuing to walk, not out of defiance, but out of devotion to what is real. This is the secret sacredness of his journey, not because it leads to salvation, but because it leads to integration. The myth teaches not that guilt must be escaped, but that it must be embraced. To carry it is to carry the full truth of being human, that we are capable of beauty and horror, and that these things are not separate, but entangled. Cain's wandering is not aimless. It is archetypal. It is the long path of making peace with contradiction, with the memory of violence, the ache of exile, the miracle of still being alive. His name becomes a vessel for all the unspoken things we carry, and for the possibility that they do not make us less worthy of love. Because something changes when we stop trying to erase our past, and instead begin to walk with it. Something softens. Not the guilt itself, but our relationship to it. It ceases to dominate and begins to teach. It becomes, in the oldest sense of the word, a guide. Cain becomes that guide. Not the polished teacher in robes of white, but the bruised figure who limps beside you and says, "Keep going. I have walked this road too." He offers not absolution, but accompaniment. Not purity, but presence. He walks beside the broken because he knows the terrain. And perhaps that is why the divine did not destroy him. Because even God, in the myth, seems to recognize that something holy can grow in ruined soil. That a man marked by violence might still carry light. That memory, even painful memory, is worth preserving. Cain is not forgotten. He is protected, not as reward, but as witness. To remember Cain is to remember that no soul is beyond story. His is a myth not of ends, but of continuance, of walking even when no one waits at the destination, of building even when no one blesses the stones, of naming children even when the past remains unhealed. He teaches us not how to begin again, but how to continue with what cannot be undone. In him, we see that the wound itself becomes a kind of doorway, a place where the sacred breaks through, not to save, but to walk with. Because the myth never promises reconciliation. It promises presence, the presence of the mark, the presence of memory, the presence of something vast and quiet, walking just beside us, reminding us that even in the worst of what we've done, there is still a path. And sometimes, that is enough. But only if we are willing to see the myth for what it truly is. Not a warning, not a judgment, but a mirror. In this mirror, something long obscured begins to emerge. The final paradox. The truth that Cain's curse may never have been a curse at all. That what we've called punishment was perhaps protection in disguise, a consecration of the broken, not a condemnation. The mark we feared was not a seal of rejection, but of recognition. It is here the story folds back upon itself. The arc that began with blood and exile now reveals its hidden center. Cain is not cast out to suffer. He is set apart to carry. He becomes the archetype of the wounded initiator,
the one who walks through death not to die, but to return transformed. He bears the pain of humanity's first great rupture, so that others might see it, name it, and not turn away. We often say he was cursed to wander, but perhaps the wandering was never about punishment. Perhaps it was about learning to hold space for what the world cannot explain. Cain becomes the keeper of the unspeakable, the sacred carrier of unresolved things, not the founder of evil, but the one who survived the truth. And the truth is this, that every great beginning is born from a fracture, that innocence is not the foundation of civilization, endurance is. We do not rise from perfection. We rise from the ashes of what we could not control, could not undo, could not prevent. Cain is not the villain of that truth. He is its witness, and in witnessing, he becomes part of the divine. This is the myth's final inversion, not to lift Cain above his act, but to reveal that the myth was never about the act. It was about what comes after. It was about whether a human being, shattered by consequence, can still hold a place in the world. And the answer, whispered beneath centuries of fear, is yes. Because Cain walks on, he marries, he fathers, he creates. He becomes the distant ancestor of artists, of makers, of those who forge beauty in the furnace of grief. The mark does not isolate him from creation. It threads him into it, not at the center, but at the edge. The edge where memory sharpens into myth and myth opens into meaning. And that meaning is not absolution. It is continuity. Cain does not return to Eden. He does not forget. But he is not destroyed. He lives marked and mindful, and in doing so, he tells a deeper story, one that we are only now beginning to hear. A story where guilt and grace walk side by side, where memory is not an obstacle to life, but the soil from which it grows. It is a story that does not resolve, but reveals. It tells us that the broken are not lost, they are marked, and sometimes that is the beginning. We close where we began, not in Eden, not in exile, but in the liminal space between. Cain's myth is not a tale of fall or flight. It is a spiral, a descent that becomes ascent, a wound that becomes wisdom. He is not a monster. He is not a hero. He is the first to carry the weight of knowing and the first to walk with it still burning in his chest. This is what makes his story eternal.
It cannot be flattened into morality nor resolved into doctrine. It lives in the contradictions it refuses to abandon: guilt and grace, ruin and renewal, memory and motion. Cain becomes the mythic embodiment of humanity's great spiritual tension, the impossibility of perfection, and the holiness of continuing anyway. He was not the first to fall, but he was the first to rise again, not in glory but in sorrow, and to keep rising, not toward redemption, but toward responsibility. And in that rise, something ancient is born, not innocence, not justice, but consciousness. Cain's legacy is not what he did, but what he carried. It is the mark that made him human. It is the silence he bore without ceasing. It is the cities he built, not despite his guilt, but because of it, as if to carve meaning into the chaos he unleashed. He does not heal the world, but he becomes a thread in its fabric, not white, not clean, but necessary. Because the world does not need saints alone. It needs those who remember. It needs those who know the cost of breaking and the art of repair. It needs those who walk with marks on their souls and still choose to build, to love, to hold space for the irreparable. Cain becomes the mythic parent of the wounded maker, those who take their unfixable truths and create something honest from them. And in that honesty, there is holiness. This is not the holiness of temples. It is not the holiness of sacrifice. It is the sacredness of breath, continued despite everything. The holiness of feet moving forward, of hands shaping what remains, of memory held not as burden, but as offering, not a cleansing, a continuity, and so the myth lives on not to warn us, but to name us. We are the ones who remember, the ones who bear, the ones who walk. We are not perfect. We are marked, but we are not alone. Thank you for walking with me through the story of Cain, not as villain, but as witness, builder, and bearer of deep human truth.
At Forgotten Lore, our mission is to unearth the myths that still breathe beneath our skin, and to speak them aloud with reverence and care. If this journey moved you, I invite you to subscribe, to stay with us as we continue exploring the sacred shadows of our shared past. Until next time, walk gently and carry the story well.